Our project is entitled Climate Change Adaptation and Water Governance, where we are actually reconciling conflicts of interest between key global sectors. Through the provision of robust knowledge and increased understanding, we are supporting water governance transformations. The project is generously supported by the Europe and Global Challenges program, a program funded by 3 European foundations: Compagnia di São Paulo, the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond and the Volkswagen Stiftung.
Two of our largest cities, Ipswich and our capital city of Brisbane, prepare and begin to experience the worst natural disaster in our history.
A tidal wave hit the small town mid-afternoon and everything in its path was washed away.
We've just heard the news that Esk is completely under.
Yes, there's a house floating down the creek.
You're joking?
No.
Locals say Sandy Creek went up 3 metres in 10 minutes and they didn't stand a chance.
High River is underwater. It's 13,000 residents under a mandatory evacuation order. Just a week ago, this was unthinkable.
The dam just can't cope. It's gauged at a whopping 190% of its normal capacity. The overflow, the water they simply have to release, is tearing down the Brisbane River.
Toowoomba is a disaster zone, a city perched on a hill under a torrent of surging water.
Queensland has already faced some dark days, and there are dark days still ahead.
Hello, I'm here in beautiful Brisbane. However, it wasn't so beautiful in January of 2011. The city here was devastated by an extreme flood event. This video is focused on 2 of the 4 work packages that comprise the CADWAGO project. In particular, we're focused on perceptions of resilience and ecosystems, but also understanding institutions and organisations that are influential in terms of water governance. More specifically, we're going to be focused on our results in relation to extreme events such as flooding, and also looking at the implications for a range of contexts such as Europe.
In their 4th assessment report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported observed drying in southern Europe and extremes in precipitation in Western and Central Europe and Russia during wintertime. In terms of our future climate in a climate-changing world, the IPCC also projects changes in droughts, increases in droughts, and increases in extreme precipitation over Europe. This includes extreme precipitation over Northern Europe and also continental Europe.
Recognizing the increasing importance of flooding throughout the world, we collaborated with a consortium of international colleagues to undertake a survey of individuals involved with flooding in countries where these events have occurred. The survey was conducted in Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Italy, and Sweden. In the survey, we asked respondents to align themselves with a way of thinking about the ecosystem that related to resilience. Most respondents felt that ecological and social dimensions of ecosystems are highly interconnected, and that how systems are defined is entirely dependent on the problem being considered. In terms of system response to flooding, most believe that systems are dynamic and complex, and adaptation is important. However, 1/4 of respondents believe that either the system is very stable and adheres to one state, or stays within a range of stable states. Finally, how respondents believe management of the system should occur was split between managing components separately, and this was particularly the case in the European countries, and defining issues and managing collaboratively. Despite some significant differences in context across countries, for example, urban versus rural settings and variation in flooding frequency, there were some important similarities among responses. One of these similarities focused on the influence of lived experience on perceptions of resilience. We asked respondents to indicate whether or not their region was resilient to flooding, and what we found was that individuals across all countries who had not personally experienced damage from flooding were more likely to perceive their region as being sufficiently resilient, whereas those who had experienced damage were equally as likely to believe the region was resilient as not. Common reasons cited for resilience or lack thereof were infrastructure, governance, experience and preparedness, and ecosystem characteristics. and these reasons were the same for both conferring resilience and detracting from it.
We asked participants about their preferences for governance, but also perceived effectiveness when it came to flood management. Overall, there was agreement across countries that a multi-sectoral collaborative approach to flood management in the context of climate change was desirable. As a second option, having the government act alone was seen as being desirable. In terms of effectiveness, a collaborative approach using many different stakeholders was seen to be the most effective way to manage flooding. On the other hand, government acting unilaterally was a second option that was preferred by respondents. These findings raise important considerations about people's preferences for and views of effectiveness when it comes to flood management and emergency response. We need to be developing approaches with strong government leadership that are collaborative and work across sectors in order to put forward the strongest effort to counter large-scale disturbances in the context of climate change.
Work Package 2 is focused on understanding both institutions and organisations, both in terms of how they function and also their capacities to be able to respond to change to things like extreme climatic events. In terms of understanding how they function, we take a systemic approach where we understand the context in which they operate, formalised structures that are created, how those formalised structures are enacted through practice, as well as the outcomes of various institutional arrangements. In terms of understanding their capacities to respond to change, we do this through using a capitals framework, where we try to understand things like financial capital, human capital, social capital, environmental capital, and built capital. Understanding institutions and organisations is critical to understand water governance and how it's enacted in practice.
Water is an indispensable human need, but there are many ways to think about and to interact with water. So we can think of it simultaneously in economic, aesthetic, religious, biophysical, and other intrinsic ways. Now these are important to understand and to identify because the way we think about water and the way that we enact it through our formal legislation and institutions has real on-ground and material outcomes in our social and ecological domains. So our review of 80 pieces of different legislation across the European Union identified a range of different definitions, and we found that these were deeply embedded in socio-political processes, and they often privilege particular worldviews. We also found tendencies towards technical definitions, but there were other notions related to the fragility and the scarcity of water, ideas about water as a human right in particular in relation to human access to drinkable, potable water. The Water Framework Directive in particular emphasises water as a tradable commodity subject to market valuation. These different definitions demonstrate a diversity of worldviews. Importantly, those that become enacted through formalised legislation impact upon and ultimately influence the sustainability of water.
Here in southeast Queensland, the challenges of climate change are many and varied, but I guess the main issue that we have to deal with is extremes in our weather systems. The predictions overall for this area is that temperatures will rise, of course, that rainfall overall will be reduced, but that rainfall will come in more extreme events interspersed with longer and more extreme drought conditions. And this provides a real challenge for the management and planning for water resources in southeast Queensland, particularly relevant to coastal flooding in rivers such as the Brisbane River here, where if we have higher intensity rainfall generating much larger floods, these need to be planned for over a period of time where perhaps the community isn't quite prepared for it because they haven't seen events like this in the past. And that was an experience recently with a major flood in the system in 2011. And it really highlights what we're going to be facing into the future.
Here we are at the Spillway Lookout in Queensland, Australia. In January 2011, those gates were opened, releasing an amazing amount of water that flooded the city of Brisbane. The 2011 floods in Brisbane gave us an opportunity to understand how institutions and organisations deal with disasters. Since then, we've been involved with 3 councils in the region of Southeast Queensland to understand how they have integrated into their core business disaster management. Some of the key points of our case study tell us about the emergence of a disaster management culture. This is really important because instead of spending time preparing plans and changing regulation, people are getting together to discuss what to do when a disaster takes place.
Our findings from the Brisbane case study show that disaster training exercises help to create localised networks of disaster managers that are able to come together collectively to respond to different types of disaster events. Secondly, while planning for these different types of events is difficult, we can plan for who responds, how they respond, and what sort of skills are required to respond to these different types of events. And thirdly, we have evidence that institutional arrangements have evolved over time, and that we now have adaptive arrangements for pre, during, and post-event conditions. Looking across all 9 international case studies that form the broader CADWAGO project, we found that participation beyond the public sphere, including non-government organisations, private industry and communities, is an essential component to successful water governance. Secondly, that including multiple forms of knowledge is a critical element of innovative water governance solutions. Thirdly, that market-based instruments have been dominant in our approaches to dealing with water dilemmas, but this ignores a whole range of social, cultural and environmental factors that make up what we now refer to as the hydro-social cycle. And lastly, we need to overcome silos that have been created by our traditional approaches to water governance. So what are the implications?
These findings raise some important questions regarding EU flood management in the context of climate change. One is, how can we best use this information to inform policy and planning, the planning of infrastructure and emergency management? And also, how can all of this information be used to devise policies that are more effective? Secondly, is there a way to narrow the gap between people's perceptions of the ecosystems they live in and resilience versus the reality that they actually experience? And how can narrowing this gap help to inform policy making for climate change in the EU?
Understanding institutional design, performance and capacity is also critical to water governance. For example, in Europe, the way water is defined has implications for the way we govern it. Ultimately, water needs to be understood as having multiple and dynamic socio-ecological dimensions, and that water governance should similarly reflect and facilitate such diversity. Our findings in relation to participation highlight the need for a critical political space that allows for non-governmental actors from multiple sectors to be able to interact and influence the governing process. This is consistent with studies that show actors who contribute to decisions are more likely to not only support but also facilitate their implementation. Another implication relates to the distortions created by market forces on local, social, cultural, religious and ecological contexts, which is of long-term relevance to sustainability. Lastly, there are examples of where adaptive institutional and organisational arrangements have been developed in response to the increasing intensity of extreme events. It is likely that these types of institutional arrangements, while still in their infancy, will have increased relevance in the future.